Have you ever imagined being adrift in the open ocean, no one around, and suddenly having your life saved by a dolphin? Well, this unbelievable story happened to an ordinary man who came face to face with death. And today, I'm going to tell you how fate, the sea, and a dolphin changed Jake Cooper's life forever. But before we dive in, if you love survival stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an episode. And tell me in the comments, do you believe animals can sense when a human is in danger? I believe they can. What about you? I want to hear your thoughts. Jake Cooper never imagined that sunrise would change everything. A seasoned fisherman, 37 years old, with sandy brown hair, always tousled by the sea wind, and eyes as blue as the ocean he loved so much. He lived in a small coastal village in Florida, where fishing wasn't just a job, it was what gave his life meaning. That week, the tides were low and the family fish market wasn't doing well. Jake, who'd braved the sea since he was a boy, decided to take a risk and venture beyond the safe fishing zone, a place that, according to the older locals, held stories no one dared to speak aloud. The sky was still painted orange when Jake left the dock in his modest boat, the Sea Breeze. The salty air filled his lungs, and the sound of the waves hitting the hull made his chest swell with hope. Maybe this would be the day his luck turned. As he pushed farther out to sea, Jake felt that nervous flutter in his stomach, a mix of excitement and fear, but he couldn't turn back. He had to bring in enough fish to save the month. The ocean seemed calm, too calm. What he didn't know was that this eerie calm was just the beginning of the nightmare. Hours passed, and Jake had gone so far out he couldn't even see the shoreline anymore, only the endless line of the horizon. That's when the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled in without warning, like a looming threat. And the radio, which always worked, was now silent. Jake's stomach turned, and a strange chill crept down his spine. He looked toward the horizon, tightened his jacket, and tried not to panic. Relax, just a passing storm, he told himself. But it wasn't. The ocean, which had embraced him all his life, now turned into a wild beast. The waves grew taller, the wind slashed like knives, and the sea breeze groaned with every violent slap from the furious water. Jake knew he was staring down the raw power of nature, and this time, he might not win. And then, in the middle of nowhere, fate played its cruelest hand. The hull cracked with a deafening snap. Jake, caught between fear and the instinct to survive, found himself thrown into the sea, alone, defenseless, at the mercy of the endless blue. The shock of the cold water hit Jake like a blade. His entire body seized, and for a few terrifying seconds, he couldn't even breathe. The waves swallowed him and spat him out like he was just another piece of driftwood. The sea breeze disappeared before his eyes. Broken planks floated around him, spinning in the violent surf, and the motor, the one that had guided him home so many times, sank slowly beneath the surface, releasing bubbles like the boat's final breath. Jake struggled against the weight of his soaked clothes, trying to stay afloat. His hands trembled, his mouth filled with salty water each time the waves crashed over him. The storm's roar swallowed everything. Thunder boomed, the wind howled like a starving beast. And him? He was just a man, far too small for this monstrous setting. No, I can't die out here. Not like this, he thought, while his arms searched frantically for something to hold on to. Adrenaline surged through his veins like fire. He spotted a chunk of the hull, a plank big enough to act as a makeshift float, and swam for it with everything he had. When he finally grabbed onto it, his palms tore open on rusted nails. But he didn't care. Pain meant nothing. All that mattered was survival. The sea, merciless, gave no rest. Every wave that crashed over him brought the fear that this would be the one to drag him under. Jake looked around and saw nothing. No boats, no lights. Only the darkness of the storm and the deep blue trying to consume him. His wristwatch, a gift from his mother, still clung to his arm, and it read 3 p.m., but the sky looked like night. Jake clung to that plank like it was the last anchor of his life. The cold started creeping in, first his hands, Then his feet, his face went numb. The salt burned his eyes, and his throat was raw from swallowing seawater. But the worst part was the emptiness, the brutal loneliness of knowing that if he died out there, no one would ever find his body. Images of his family flooded his mind. His father waiting on the dock, his little sister calling his name, his mother, who had always warned him that the sea could betray. Jake let out a desperate scream, a roar that was swallowed whole by the storm. "I won't die here. I promised I'd come back," he shouted into the void. That's when it hit him. The radio, the life vest, it was all gone. He was alone with nothing but that piece of wood and sheer willpower. The hours began to drag. Jake no longer knew if what he saw was real or just hallucinations. He trembled uncontrollably, his vision blurred, and the worst thought crept in. What if no one even noticed he was missing? What if no one was looking for him? He drifted so far out that maybe no one had any idea where to start. Just as despair nearly made him let go, a small shadow appeared, swimming close to the plank. Jake's eyes widened, his heart pounding. For a moment, he thought it was a shark, and that his end had come. But it wasn't. A fin sliced through the water gently, almost like it was watching him. Jake, caught between fear and hope, tried to focus. And there, for the first time in hours, he saw something different. A dolphin. The animal swam in circles, as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." Jake had no idea, but that improbable encounter would change everything. The sea still roared, and Jake could no longer feel his fingers. Exhaustion had taken over, and his eyes shut involuntarily. Every muscle screamed in pain. But even there, on the verge of blacking out, that small movement in the water held his attention. The silvery fin surfaced and vanished, cutting through the waves with a grace Jake could barely comprehend. At first, fear took over. What if it's a shark? What if this is how it ends? He thought. But unlike all the shark attack stories he'd heard, this creature moved calmly, almost like it was studying Jake's every move. The dolphin came closer. Jake could see it clearly now. It was big, its gray back shimmering every time lightning split the sky. The animal didn't seem the least bit afraid of the chaos around them. On the contrary, it moved with a serenity that brought an eerie sense of peace. Jake let out a nervous, half-crazed laugh. "You came to watch me die, buddy?" he whispered, his voice raspy from screaming and swallowing salt water. But the dolphin didn't leave. It stayed, circling around, like an old friend refusing to let him go. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Jake couldn't tell anymore. But that animal, that simple presence, began to change something inside him. Despair started to make room for a faint, almost childlike hope. He remembered the stories he'd heard as a kid, sailors' legends about dolphins saving people, mystical creatures protecting those who respected the sea. "You gonna save me? Is that it?" Jake murmured, feeling tears mix with the salt water on his face. The dolphin dove and surfaced again, closer now, nearly touching the plank. For a brief moment, Jake felt like he wasn't alone in that vast ocean anymore. The animal felt like a silent guardian, the last flicker of life in the darkness. And there, in the heart of the storm, something in Jake reignited. He couldn't give up. Not now. Jake tried to adjust himself on the plank, but his body wasn't cooperating. Every move was agony. The cold had taken everything, and hunger gnawed at his gut. He knew he didn't have much time. Someone had to find him soon, or... That's when the dolphin did something Jake would never forget. It jumped ahead of him, like trying to catch his attention, then began swimming in a specific direction. It would stop, look back, and repeat the motion. Jake stared at it for a few seconds until it hit him. You want me to follow you?" he whispered, incredulous. The sea was still vicious, but that simple gesture, so unlikely, sparked something in Jake. He didn't know if he was delirious, if he was just seeing what he wanted to see, but he decided to try. Clinging to the plank, he used what little strength he had and started moving in the direction the dolphin pointed. Every meter was a battle, but deep down, Jake felt, somehow, that the animal wasn't there by accident. The dolphin swam slowly, waiting for Jake to keep up. The sky was still dark, but for the first time in hours, Jake felt something he hadn't. He wasn't lost anymore. He wasn't alone. And for the first time, a voice inside him whispered, "Maybe I have a chance." Jake never imagined he'd one day depend on a dolphin to survive, but there he was, clinging to a piece of driftwood, his body wrecked by cold, and his eyes locked on the creature that now seemed to be his only hope. The ocean showed no mercy, but the dolphin kept swimming ahead, as if carving out an invisible path through the chaos. Every few meters, it would dive and resurface, always casting what felt like a human glance back at Jake, as if saying, "Come on, I'm here." Jake poured every last drop of strength into paddling with his hands, pushing the plank toward his unlikely guide. His arms were lead-heavy, his nails broken, the skin on his palms starting to peel. But the fear of dying out there, alone, was stronger than any pain. The horizon stayed gray, and the rain fell in thin, icy needles. Jake looked up at the sky and whispered, "Please, just give me a little more strength. Just a little more." The dolphin seemed to understand the desperation. At one point, it swam so close that Jake felt the urge to reach out and touch that gleaming back. But he didn't dare. He didn't want to break the silent bond forming between them. The animal dove under and resurfaced, this time carrying something on its snout, a thick, green clump of seaweed which it tossed near Jake. The fisherman stared at it, confused, unsure what to do. But the dolphin repeated the gesture twice more, as if trying to show him something. That's when Jake understood. The vegetation meant one thing: land nearby. Hope exploded in his chest. He knew that kind of seaweed only floated up when brought in by currents close to shore, or near some submerged rock formations. "You're telling me there's land around here?" he asked, knowing he wouldn't get an answer. The dolphin leapt again, pushing ahead a few more meters. Jake took a deep breath, grabbed the plank with all the strength he had left, and followed. His head throbbed, his body showed signs of complete exhaustion. But he couldn't stop now. Minute by minute, meter by meter, Jake dragged himself through the water, guided by the creature that refused to let him give up. Every time he thought about letting go and surrendering, the dolphin would reappear, circle around him, and move forward again, like it was pulling Jake back from the edge of death. And during that improbable, silent journey, Jake started to remember everything he had left behind. His mother on the porch, waiting for him to come home. The smell of morning coffee. The sound of the waves hitting the dock in the village. He couldn't die out there. Not like this. The sea, which had once seemed like a monstrous, untamable beast, now felt like a vast battlefield. And Jake was fighting inch by inch with the dolphin as his most loyal ally. He had no idea how much time had passed, but Jake began to notice subtle changes in the waves. Something in the scent of the air. A breeze that was less salty, more humid. The current was shifting, and that could only mean one thing. The dolphin, as if it knew exactly what was going through Jake's mind, made one final leap, slicing through the gray sky. It was the sign Jake needed. "We're getting close." "I know we are," he murmured with his cracked voice. Time seemed to freeze. Jake didn't know if he'd been out there for hours or days. His body hurt in ways he never thought possible. Every muscle burned, his skin was raw, his throat raw and dry from swallowing salt water. But there was something different now. A subtle shift in the air, almost imperceptible. But to someone like him, it meant everything. The dolphin, still ahead, twirled playfully in the water, as if it knew something Jake couldn't see yet. With each jump, the animal looked back to check if Jake was still coming. And he was. Even if his strength was hanging by a thread, Jake refused to let go of the plank. That animal had become his anchor, and now, maybe, his guide to salvation. Then, in a moment between one breath and the next, Jake felt something different. The smell of salt air grew stronger, but there was also the scent of wet earth, a subtle fragrance, but unmistakable. His tired eyes widened, and he tried to lift his chin to see beyond the waves. At first, just the endless gray of sea and sky. But then, on the horizon, a dark streak, small, barely visible. Jake blinked several times, thinking his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. But the shape stayed there. "No, no way," he whispered hoarsely. His heart pounded in his chest. For a moment he forgot the pain. That dark line on the horizon could be an illusion. Or it could be land. Jake rubbed his eyes and looked again. This time he was sure. It was an uneven silhouette, as if it were rocks, or maybe the beginning of a small reef. The dolphin swam up to him, and as if confirming his thoughts, slapped its tail hard against the water and darted off in that direction. "It's land. You brought me to land," Jake whispered, feeling tears fall and blend with the salt water. Emotion overwhelmed him. It was like watching a miracle unfold right before his eyes. But there was still one final challenge. Even with the coast in sight, the current was still strong, and Jake's body was threatening to give out with every stroke. The sun began to break through the dark clouds, lighting up the silhouette of that long-awaited salvation. Jake gathered every ounce of strength he had left and started dragging himself through the churning waters. The plank barely supported him anymore, but he didn't care. Land was just ahead now, and he'd reach it, even if he had to crawl with his teeth. The dolphin swam beside him, almost like a loyal bodyguard, alert to every move. The water was starting to shallow, and Jake could feel the currents shifting, signaling the ocean floor was rising beneath him. The sound of waves crashing against rocks reached his ears. It was like music, the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Jake felt solid ground beneath the plank, a sandy bottom, and relief erupted in a cry that tore from his throat. "I made it. Oh God, I made it." It took time before he had the strength to drag himself up onto the dark sand of the small island. But when he finally collapsed on his knees on the shore, his whole body gave out. He cried like a child, from relief, from pain, from sheer gratitude. The dolphin was still watching him from the water, and before disappearing beneath the waves, it made one final leap, a silent farewell. Jake smiled, even through the tears. He was alive. And it was all, thanks to that unlikely savior. Jake could hardly believe he was finally on solid ground. His body collapsed onto the wet sand, and he stayed there for long minutes, unable to move. Every breath hurt, but for the first time, the air didn't smell like death. It smelled like life, and that simple detail reignited his will to keep fighting. The sky began to clear, revealing a shy sun that cast golden rays across the still angry sea. Jake turned slowly, facing the ocean that had nearly killed him, and smiled, weakly. The dolphin was gone, as if its mission was complete. Now it was just him, alone, on an island he had no idea how to locate. "Come on, Jake. You didn't go through all this just to die here now," he whispered to himself. Summoning what little strength he had left, he tried to stand. His legs shook like paper. Every muscle screamed, begging for rest. But Jake knew he couldn't afford that luxury. The sun would go down soon, and with it would come new dangers. Looking around, he saw the island was small, surrounded by rocks and dense vegetation. Gnarled trees appeared in the distance, forming a landscape straight out of a movie. Coconuts lay scattered across the ground, and a faint trail of smoke on the horizon caught Jake's eye. But he chose to ignore it, unsure if it was real or a hallucination from his exhausted mind. His first goal was simple: find shelter and water. His body needed rest and hydration, and he knew that if he didn't get both soon, he wouldn't last much longer. Dragging his feet through the hot sand, he began exploring what would be his new home, at least until he figured out how to get off that island. The ground was covered in dry leaves, and the sound of birds echoed through the air, giving the place a strange sense of life, but also a haunting solitude. Jake found a crevice between two large rocks, covered by dry branches. It wasn't much, but it would serve as shelter for his first night. He crawled inside, arranged some branches to shield himself from the wind, and for a moment closed his eyes. He just wanted to sleep, to forget everything, but his stomach growled loudly, reminding him that the fight wasn't over. Jake looked around and spotted a low-hanging coconut tree full of green fruit. He smiled. At least there's that. With great effort, he climbed the tree the way he used to as a kid. Each pull shredded the skin of his hands even more, but the thought of the coconut water kept him going. When he finally knocked 2 down, he fell back into the sand and, without hesitation, smashed one against a rock until it cracked. The first sip was almost miraculous. The cool, sweet water trickled down his chin as Jake drank like a man who hadn't tasted water in days. Which, in a way, was true. That simple act, that taste of coconut, rekindled something inside him. I can do this. I'm gonna make it, he thought. As the evening fell, Jake gathered dry leaves and tried, unsuccessfully, to start a fire. His hands shook too much, and the exhaustion made it impossible to focus. In the end, he accepted that he'd have to spend the night in the dark, listening to the sound of the sea and the forest. But something inside him shifted in that moment. For the first time, Jake realized that surviving the shipwreck had only been the beginning of his battle. Now he had a new mission: find a way to get out of there, alive. The first morning on the island was a shock for Jake. When the first rays of sun touched his skin, he woke curled up between the rocks, muscles locked, lips cracked, and mouth dry. For a second, he thought it had all been a nightmare, but the sound of waves crashing against stone hit him again, hard and real. He was really there, lost, alone. The following days were a mixture of agony and small victories. Jake quickly discovered that the worst enemy out there wasn't fear or the ocean. It was loneliness. The absolute silence, broken only by bird cries and the wind, messed with his mind. Sometimes he heard voices. Other times, he swore the dolphin appeared again in the waves, but it was just his brain trying to find company where there was none. Hunger also came fast. The coconuts were his first relief, but they didn't last long. Jake realized he had to act, or his body would shut down. He started exploring deeper into the island, facing the unknown with each hesitant step. His legs wobbled, his chest heaved, and the thick jungle scent reminded him he was still alive, and that the fight was far from over. It was on the 3rd day that he found a small stream cutting through the dense vegetation. The water was crystal clear, and he dropped to his knees, drinking directly from the stream like a wild animal. The relief was so overwhelming that Jake cried. In that cold water, he felt a flicker of hope reignite. Survival instincts kicked in. Jake began setting small traps using rocks and branches, hoping to catch something, anything. He also ventured to the shoreline, searching for mussels and shellfish between the rocks. The first one he managed to catch felt like both a gift and a punishment. Jake didn't know how to prepare it properly, so he ate it raw. The sensation was awful. The taste, the smell, everything about it screamed that it wasn't meant to be food. But the hunger was stronger than the disgust, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to fight for your life. The nights were the worst part. The cold sliced through his skin, and he trembled so violently it hurt. With no fire, no real shelter. Each sunset was a cruel reminder that the next day might not come. He heard noises in the jungle, sounds that made him curl up in fear, praying no predator would come. But what hurt the most was the emptiness. Jake talked to himself, counted the days by carving marks into rocks, and thought about his family constantly. His mother's face, his sister's smile, the smell of the village. It all felt so far away, like memories from another life. Sometimes he'd shout their names into the wind, just to feel like he still existed. And through all of it, he kept thinking about the dolphin. If it hadn't guided me here, I'd be dead. That memory was the only thing keeping him going. The idea that life had given him a second chance, and he couldn't waste it. The days dragged on. Jake no longer knew what day of the week it was. His body had grown thinner, his eyes sunken, but he kept going. Every sunrise was a silent victory. Days turned into weeks. Jake no longer knew exactly how long he'd been on that island. Every sunrise looked the same, every sunset, a harsh reminder that no one had found him yet. His face was no longer the same. Unshaven, sunburned skin, and eyes that carried the weight of profound loneliness. The daily fight to survive had become a mechanical ritual. Searching for water, hunting small animals, risking trips to the shore to gather shellfish. It all repeated, in a lonely, brutal routine. But it was one morning, before the sun had even broken the horizon, that the biggest twist of all happened. Jake woke to the strong scent of smoke in the air. His heart jumped. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him again. But it wasn't a hallucination. The smell was there, strong, real. He jumped to his feet, sore muscles protesting with every move. He looked up and saw it, a thin column of smoke rising not far off behind the twisted trees. Impossible, or maybe not. The thought exploded in his mind. Someone's here. I'm not alone. Jake's chest filled with a mix of fear and hope. Who else could be on that island? Another castaway? A lost fisherman? Or something worse he didn't want to imagine? Still, the chance of finding another human being rekindled something inside him. Without thinking twice, Jake plunged into the jungle, ignoring the branches tearing at his skin, the slick, damp ground. The smoke was all that mattered now. He moved as fast as he could, heart pounding in his chest. But as he got closer, something strange began to emerge. The smell of smoke was too strong. Something big was burning. When he finally broke through the trees, what he saw chilled him to the core. It wasn't a rescue fire, or a campsite. It was the remains of a small boat, run aground on the rocks, completely burned. The hull still released dark smoke, and charred pieces of wood floated in the low tide. Jake froze. His heart sank, and for a moment, the world spun around him. Oh God, someone tried to escape, and died trying. The smell of death hung in the air. Jake stepped forward, hesitant, stomach churning. Among the wreckage, he found torn tarps, pieces of netting, and what looked like a seatbelt, burnt, almost unrecognizable. The scene was a brutal reminder that this island wasn't a refuge. It was a prison. And worse, others had been here before, and they hadn't made it. Jake dropped to his knees, hands clutching his head. The hope he'd carried turned into a heavy stone pressing down on his chest. For the first time, he seriously thought about giving up. The sun slowly rose, casting light over that graveyard of dreams. And Jake could only think, I'm already dead. No one's going to find me. I'll end up just like them. The tears came before he could stop them. A deep, aching sob from someone who had no strength left, no faith left. But in that rock-bottom moment, a memory returned. The dolphin's gaze, that final leap before vanishing. Jake closed his eyes and took a deep breath. You didn't bring me here, just to die like this, did you? And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, Jake felt something different. It wasn't strength or courage. It was anger. Anger at the thought of accepting that ending. He stood up, took a deep breath, and looked at the sky. If I'm going to die here, it'll be fighting until the last damn second. And there, among the ashes, Jake made a decision. He wasn't going to quit. After hours staring at the charred remains, Jake felt hollow. The scene played over and over in his mind. The burned boat, the smell of death, the proof that this patch of land wasn't a haven, but a grave for those who, like him, tried to survive. But there, between despair and fear, something shifted inside him. Jake realized that if he wanted to make it out alive, he couldn't just wait anymore. He had to act. He had to make himself seen, even if he wasn't sure anyone was still looking for him. Using what was left of the wrecked boat, Jake improvised a massive signal fire. He dragged charred wood, stacked it all at the highest point on the beach, and with the little flame he managed to spark from friction and stone, he lit the fire. The flames shot high, sending thick black smoke into the sky. Jake stepped back, out of breath, his eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. He looked at that blaze and for the first time in days felt that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. The sun was high when he heard it. A distant sound, barely audible at first. Jake held his breath. His heart pounded in his chest. Was it another hallucination? His exhaustion playing tricks? But the sound came again. Deep, constant, an engine. Jake ran down the beach, stumbling through the soft sand, screaming at the top of his lungs, arms flailing wildly. Here! I'm here! Over here! The sound grew louder, and then he saw it, a shadow forming on the horizon. A boat, not a massive ship, just a simple fishing boat like his used to be. But to Jake, it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He screamed louder, waved his arms, jumped, did everything he could. And then the boat turned. It was coming toward the island. Jake collapsed onto the sand, sobbing. It was real. He wasn't hallucinating. Help was here. Someone had finally seen him. Minutes later, the boat pulled up to shore, and two men jumped out, rushing toward him. "Oh my God, there's someone here," one of them said, eyes wide as he took in Jake's appearance. Thin, sunburned, wounded, but alive. I thought I'd never see anyone again," Jake whispered, voice cracking. The fishermen couldn't believe the story they were hearing. One of them, named Tom, looked at his buddy and said, "This guy's a miracle." Jake was brought onto the boat. As they pulled away from the island, he looked back at that patch of land that had nearly become his grave, and in that moment, something incredible happened. In the distance, cutting through the water, Jake saw the silver dorsal fin, the dolphin, as if it had returned, just to say goodbye. Jake smiled through the tears. "Thank you, buddy." The boat sailed on, leaving the island behind. Jake leaned against the side, feeling the wind on his face, the scent of the sea. But this time, it wasn't the scent of death. It was the scent of life. When the coastline appeared on the horizon, Jake closed his eyes and made a silent promise. He would never live the same way again. He would never take anything for granted, because now he knew the true value of life, and all because a dolphin decided not to let him die. The return to shore was something Jake would never forget. The fisherman's boat glided across calm seas, as if nature, after all the trials, was finally offering him peace. The sky was clear, the sun shone brightly, and the smell of land grew stronger with each passing second. Jake, resting against the boat's rail, stared at the horizon, unable to hold back tears. It wasn't just relief. It was everything at once: pain, gratitude, exhaustion, and a joy so immense it barely fit in his chest. He had made it. Against all odds, he had survived. When they reached the village, the scene was surreal. People ran to the dock, speechless. Some couldn't believe what they were seeing. That thin, burned, unrecognizable man was Jake Cooper. The fisherman everyone had already mourned. Jake's mother was there, and when she saw him, she collapsed to her knees. The cry she let out pierced the air and went straight to his heart. Jake tried to run, but his legs gave out. Even so, he moved, stumbling, crawling, until he fell into her arms. The hug was tight, desperate, as if she needed to be sure he was real. I knew you'd come back," his mother whispered between sobs. Jake cried like a child. There was no room for pride or shame. The only thing that mattered was being there, back, in the arms of those who loved him. People gathered, listened to his story, and no one could believe it. A dolphin? An animal guiding a lost man through the open sea? It was unbelievable, but Jake's eyes didn't lie. The story was real, and no one dared to question it. Days passed, and Jake slowly recovered. Every warm meal, every bath, every night in a real bed felt like a gift from above. But something inside him had changed forever. The sea, which once felt like a second home, now commanded even deeper respect. Jake knew the ocean can give you life, and it can take it away in an instant. But what stayed with him most was the memory of that dolphin. The image of the silver fin cutting through the water, the almost human look in its eyes, the way it showed up in the most desperate moment of his life. Jake began studying dolphins, reading accounts, listening to stories. He discovered he wasn't the only one, that over the years, many others had been saved by these incredible animals, as if they knew, as if they felt human desperation. And that's when Jake decided what to do with the rest of his life. He sold the last boat the family had and poured everything into a new purpose. He started a project to study and protect dolphins in the region, giving talks and taking children out to meet these amazing creatures. If one day I can give back even a fraction of what that dolphin did for me, it'll all have been worth it, Jake would say. Time went on. But even today, when the sun sets and the sea glows gold on the horizon, Jake sits at the dock, looks out at the ocean, and smiles. And Jake was never the same again, because after surviving the impossible, he understood the true value of life. And believe it, sometimes miracles come from where we least expect them.